The scalpel stopped mid-cut. Sarah Henderson's hand trembled above the open abdomen of her 80-year-old patient. The surgical team had expected a tumor, something routine, removable, perhaps malignant, but treatable. What lay beneath the retractor was none of those things. "What is that?" the scrub nurse whispered, embedded in thick scar tissue, wrapped in decades of the body's desperate attempt to contain it, was something that didn't belong. A small metallic capsule, no larger than a silver dollar, deliberately sewn into the abdominal wall. The tissue around it had grown abnormally, forming the mass that had brought Margaret Whitmore to this operating table. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. This wasn't a medical device. This wasn't an accident. Someone had put this inside Mrs. Whitmore, intentionally, and from the look of the surrounding scar tissue, it had been there for decades. "Doctor!" The anesthesiologist's voice cut through her shock. Her pressure's dropping. Sarah forced her hand steady. "Extract it, carefully. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story." 3 weeks before the surgery, Margaret Whitmore had been tending her roses in the small garden behind her Portland home. At 80 years old, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who knew her body's limits but refused to surrender to them. The morning sun caught the silver in her hair as she knelt beside a particularly stubborn weed, her hand unconsciously drifting to her abdomen, a habit so old she no longer noticed it. Inside her modest living room, a black-and-white photograph held pride of place on the mantel. A young woman of 28 stared out from the frame, wearing crisp Navy nurse's uniform, her eyes bright with purpose. The year was 1970. That woman seemed like a stranger now, separated by decades and a lifetime of quiet grief. Maggie had been widowed for 15 years. Thomas had been a good man, patient with her silences and the nightmares that occasionally still woke her in the dark. They'd raised 2 children together, though only one had been born to them. Her son Robert lived in Seattle now, a successful corporate attorney at 52. He called every Sunday at precisely 6 p.m., their conversations polite and brief. He'd been married once, divorced, no children. When she asked if he was happy, he always said he was fine, which wasn't the same thing at all. Her daughter Emily had stayed close, teaching 3rd grade just 20 minutes away. She visited 3 times a week with her 2 children in tow, filling the house with noise and life. At 48, Emily had her father's warmth, but something else too, a watchfulness, as if she was always waiting for something to break. The sensation had started to settle, a flutter, almost like butterfly wings deep in her belly. Maggie had dismissed it as age, as digestion, as anything ordinary. But by the 2nd week, the fluttering had become a rhythmic pulse, mechanical and wrong. By the 3rd week, the pain arrived sharp, insistent, impossible to ignore. Dr. James Mitchell had been her physician for 20 years. When she finally came to him, the concern in his weathered face told her everything. The CT scan revealed a mass, irregular and troubling. Within days, she found herself in a hospital gown, signing consent forms while Robert flew in from Seattle and Emily held her hand too tightly. Mrs. Whitmore, to Sarah Henderson, had said during their consultation, her dark eyes kind but professional. "We need to operate as soon as possible. The mass is growing, and we need to determine what we're dealing with." There had been something in the surgeon's gaze, a flicker of recognition that Maggie couldn't place. But at 80, she'd learned that memory played tricks, that faces blurred together across the years. She hadn't known that morning, signing those forms, that the surgeon who would open her body already shared a connection with her that defied coincidence, that the object inside her had been waiting 50 years to tell its story, that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually demand to be heard. The morning arrived with a gray Portland drizzle that matched the mood in the surgical waiting room. Robert Whitmore had caught the last flight from Seattle the night before. Arriving at the hospital at dawn with shadows under his eyes and his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, he'd changed from his suit into jeans and a sweater. But the transformation felt incomplete. He still carried himself like a man in a courtroom, rigid and guarded. Emily had been there since 5 a.m., curled in an uncomfortable plastic chair with a cold cup of coffee growing colder in her hands. Her eyes were swollen, and when Robert walked in, she stood to embrace him. He accepted the hug stiffly, patting her back twice before pulling away. "Any word?" he asked. "They took her back 20 minutes ago. Dr. Henderson said it would take 3 to 4 hours." Robert nodded, pulling out his laptop. Emily watched him open a case file, his fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical efficiency. "Do you have to work right now?" "This is how I cope," he said without looking up. "You have your way, I have mine." She bit back a response, returning to her chair. The waiting room television murmured news neither of them heard. Other families occupied other corners, wrapped in their own private anxieties. Time moved like honey, thick and slow. In the pre-operative room 2 hours earlier, Maggie had been surprisingly calm. The nurses had commented on it. Most patients her age showed fear. But she simply lay on the gurney with her hands folded across her chest, studying the ceiling tiles as if they held answers to questions she'd long stopped asking. Sarah Henderson had come to see her before the anesthesia. At 45, Sarah had built a reputation as one of Portland's finest surgeons. Her hands steady, her judgment sound. She specialized in complex abdominal cases, the kind other doctors referred out. But standing beside Maggie's gurney, her professional composure had flickered. "Mrs. Whitmore," she'd said, her voice careful, "how are you feeling? At my age, you learn that fear is just wasted energy." Maggie replied, "What will be, will be." Sarah had picked up the chart, but her eyes kept drifting to the patient's face. There was something there, a recognition she couldn't name. When she noticed the photocopy of Maggie's old military ID in the file included, because of her veteran's benefits, she'd stared at it longer than necessary. The young woman in that photograph wore a Navy nurse's uniform, her hair dark, her smile bright with youth and certainty. "Have we met before, Doctor?" Maggie asked, noticing the prolonged gaze. Sarah blinked, shaking her head. "I don't think so, Mrs. Whitmore, though you have a kind face. Familiar, somehow. I used to be a nurse, long time ago. Maybe we crossed paths in another life." "Maybe," Sarah said softly, but something in her chest had tightened, a feeling she couldn't explain. She glanced once more at that old photograph before closing the file. "I'll take good care of you." "I know you will, dear." Now, at 8:45 a.m., Sarah stood in operating room 3 with her team assembled around her. The anesthesiologist had confirmed the patient was under vitals stable. Sarah made the first incision with practiced precision, the scalpel moving through skin and subcutaneous tissue with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Retractor," she said, and the scrub nurse placed it in her palm. They'd expected to find a tumor. The CT scan had shown a mass, irregular but contained. The plan was straightforward. Identify it, remove it if possible, biopsy if not. Sarah had reviewed the images a dozen times. This should have been routine. But when she opened the peritoneal cavity and moved aside the layers of tissue, her hands... "Stop it. What is that?" the scrub nurse whispered. Embedded in the abdominal wall, surrounded by thick bands of scar tissue that had clearly formed over decades, was something that shouldn't exist. A small cylindrical capsule made of what appeared to be surgical-grade titanium, deliberately placed and carefully sewn into the muscle layer. The tissue around it had grown in response to the foreign object, creating the mass that had shown up on the scan. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears. This wasn't a tumor. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had put this inside Margaret Whitmore intentionally, surgically, and from the look of the scar tissue, it had been there for an impossibly long time. "Doctor," the anesthesiologist's voice cut through her shock. "Her blood pressure's dropping. 100/60?" Sarah forced herself to focus, to push aside the 100 questions screaming in her mind. Stabilize her. Increase fluids. She looked at the capsule, at the way it had been secured with what looked like ancient sutures, now absorbed by the body but leaving their pattern in the tissue. "We need to extract this carefully. I want it intact." Her hands moved automatically, the years of training overriding the chaos of her thoughts. But even as she worked, Sarah couldn't stop staring at the impossible object beneath her fingers. Someone had done this decades ago to a young Navy nurse named Margaret. And somehow, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that when they opened that capsule, nothing would ever be the same. The capsule sat under the harsh lights of the pathology lab like an accusation. Sarah had insisted on being present when they opened it, though protocol didn't require the surgeon's attendance. She stood beside the senior pathologist, Marcus Chen, watching as he carefully cleaned the exterior. The titanium had weathered 50 years inside a human body, but the seal remained intact. "Whoever placed this knew what they were doing," Marcus observed. "Medical-grade materials, surgical precision. This wasn't amateur work." Sarah's throat felt tight. "Can you open it without damaging the contents?" "Give me a moment." Marcus worked with delicate instruments, finding the seam where the capsule had been sealed. With a soft click, it separated into 2 halves. Inside, protected from decades of bodily fluids and cellular invasion, lay a single piece of paper. The edges had yellowed slightly, but the handwriting remained legible. Careful, deliberate script in fading blue ink. Marcus lifted it with tweezers, placing it under a magnifying light. Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the room must hear it. The header read, "Operation Baby Lift, April 1970, Nurse Margaret Hayes." Below it, a list of 23 names. each one accompanied by an age, a brief medical note, and a designation of their intended adoptive families in the United States. The names were Vietnamese, the ages ranging from 6 months to 3 years old. Sarah's vision blurred. She gripped the edge of the table. The first name on the list read, Lisa Nguyen, 6 months old. Severe malnutrition, recovering, assigned to Henderson family, Portland, Oregon. Dr. Henderson. Marcus's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? You look pale. She couldn't speak. Her hands trembled as she pointed at the name, at the notation beside it. Marcus followed her finger, his expression shifting from concern to confusion to dawning comprehension. That's... he started. That's me, Sarah whispered. That was my name before. Her adoptive parents had told her the story. Of course, how they'd desperately wanted a child, how they'd applied to adopt one of the orphans from the fall of Saigon, how they'd received a call in April of 1905 that a baby girl needed a home, how they'd driven to the airport and met a tiny, malnourished infant who'd survived a journey that had killed so many others. They'd renamed her Sarah, given her their name, Henderson, raised her with love and certainty and all the privileges of an American childhood. But they'd kept the old photographs, the paperwork, the memories of that first day. Sarah had seen the pictures. A young Navy nurse in the photograph holding Sarah as an infant, both of them on what looked like a cargo plane. The nurse's face had been partially obscured, the photo quality poor. Sarah had never known her name until now. Margaret Hayes, Sarah breathed. She's Margaret Whitmore now. She's the patient. Marcus stared at her. The woman we just operated on is the nurse who saved you. Sarah couldn't answer. Her eyes had moved to the rest of the list, to the 22 other names. Beside each one, in that same careful handwriting, were notations. And beside 22 of those names, as someone had later added a small cross in pencil. At the bottom of the page, in different handwriting, masculine, hurried were the words, May these children find peace. Forgive me, Margaret. I loved you. We need to research this, Marcus said quietly. Operation Baby Lift. I remember hearing about it. The airlift of orphans from Vietnam during the fall of Saigon. Sarah already knew what they would find. The first flight, a C-5A Galaxy cargo plane, had crashed shortly after takeoff on April 4, 1907. Of the 330 people aboard, 138 had died, most of them children. She'd been one of the survivors, one of the lucky ones. Her parents had shown her the newspaper clippings, explained the tragedy that had surrounded her rescue. But she'd been too young to remember any of it, just 6 months old, too small to carry conscious memory of the chaos, the fear, the nurses who'd shielded babies with their own bodies when the plane went down. But somewhere in the deepest part of her mind, she remembered something, a voice singing softly, a melody she sometimes hummed without knowing why. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. The other names, Sarah said, her voice breaking. We need to check them against the casualty list. Marcus nodded, already pulling out his phone. The search took only minutes. When he looked up, his face had gone gray. 22 of the names on this list appear on the official casualty records from the crash, he said softly. Only one survivor matches. Lisa Nguyen. You? Sarah's knees buckled. Marcus caught her arm, guiding her to a chair. The implications crashed over her like waves. Margaret Whitmore, nurse. Margaret Hayes, had carried these names inside her body for 50 years. 22 children she couldn't save, and one she had. She didn't know, Sarah whispered. All these years, she didn't know I survived. How did this get inside her? Marcus asked. Who put it there? Sarah looked at the initials at the bottom of the page. O.P. A medical professional, clearly. Someone with surgical skills and access to a patient. Someone who'd loved Margaret enough to do something inexplicable and arguably unethical. Someone who'd wanted her to carry those children with her forever. In the surgical recovery room, Margaret Whitmore was beginning to wake from anesthesia, unaware that the weight she'd carried in her abdomen for half a century had finally been given a name. Unaware that the baby she'd sung to on a doomed flight, the infant she'd cradled and mourned, was the surgeon who'd just saved her life. Unaware that the impossible circle was finally, after 50 years, about to close. Margaret Whitmore's eyes opened slowly, fighting against the fog of anesthesia. The hospital room came into focus in fragments, white ceiling tiles, the beep of monitors, and two faces hovering above her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Robert stood stiff and uncomfortable, while Emily gripped the bed rail so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "You're awake. Thank God." Maggie tried to speak, but her throat was desert dry. Emily quickly brought a cup of water with a straw, holding it steady while her mother took careful sips. The cool liquid helped, though everything still felt distant and strange. "The surgery," Maggie managed. "Did it go well?" Robert and Emily exchanged a glance that made Maggie's stomach clench. After 30 years of being a mother, she knew that look. It meant they were deciding how much truth she could handle. "The tumor was benign," Robert said carefully. "Dr. Henderson removed it successfully. But, Mom, they found something else inside you, something that shouldn't have been there." Maggie's heart rate picked up, making the monitor beep faster. "What do you mean?" Emily sat on the edge of the bed, taking her mother's hand. "A capsule made of titanium. It had been surgically placed inside your abdominal wall decades ago, from what the doctor said." The words made no sense. Maggie shook her head weakly. "I don't understand. What kind of capsule? It had names in it, Mom," Emily continued, her eyes filling with tears. "A list of 23 names. Children's names? From Operation Baby Lift." The world stopped spinning. Maggie's breath caught in her chest, and for a moment she couldn't breathe at all. The babies, her babies, the 23 tiny souls she'd cared for during those final chaotic days in Vietnam. The children she'd promised to keep safe, to deliver to their new families, to their new lives. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face before she'd even consciously registered the grief. "No, no, no, my babies. I thought I'd lost them. I thought I'd never—" The sobs took over. 50 years of buried grief erupting from some deep place she'd locked away. Emily climbed fully onto the bed, cradling her mother as Maggie wept. Robert stood frozen, his lawyer's composure cracking as he watched his mother come undone. "Tell me," Maggie gasped between sobs. "Tell me what happened to them, please." Emily looked at Robert, who shook his head slightly. Not yet. But Emily had never been able to deny her mother anything. "We're still finding out," she said gently. But, Mom, one of them survived. One of the babies made it. Maggie looked up, hope and terror warring in her eyes. Which one? Who? We don't know yet, Emily lied, the truth too large and strange to burden her mother with just now. But we're going to find out, I promise. Later, after Maggie had been given something to help her rest, Robert pulled Emily into the hallway. His face was set in the expression she'd seen him wear in courtrooms when he was about to dismantle an opponent's case piece by piece. "Who put that capsule inside her?" he demanded. "This is assault, Emily. Medical malpractice at minimum. Whoever did this violated her without consent." "I know," Emily said quietly. "But Robert, whoever did it, preserved those names. Mom's been carrying those children with her all these years. Maybe that person thought they were helping." "Helping!" Robert's voice rose, and a passing nurse shot them a warning look. He lowered it to a harsh whisper. "They put a foreign object inside our mother's body without her knowledge or permission. That's not helping. That's—" "I know," Emily interrupted. "I know. And we'll get answers. Mom mentioned a surgery in September. She said an emergency appendectomy at the Naval Hospital in San Diego." Robert was already pulling out his phone. "I'll get the medical records. Find out who her surgeon was. Robert, it was 50 years ago. The surgeon is probably dead or retired, I know. But they'll have family records, something." He was typing rapidly, the way he did when a case consumed him. "We'll trace it, find out who did this and why." While Robert made calls, Emily sat in the waiting room with her laptop, searching for information about Operation Baby Lift. The photographs that came up made her stomach turn. Tiny children being loaded onto cargo planes, desperate faces, chaos at the Saigon airport as the city fell, and then the images of the crash, the twisted wreckage of the C-5 Galaxy that had gone down just miles from its departure point, killing 138 people in what should have been a rescue mission. She found the official casualty list and cross-referenced it with the names from the capsule that Dr. Henderson had photographed for the records. Her hands shook as she went down the list. 22 matches. 22 of the children her mother had cared for us had died in that crash. Only one had survived, Lisa Nguyen. 6 months old, Emily's search for Lisa's adoption records took her to the Oregon State Archives, then to old newspaper articles about the orphan airlift. And there, in a Portland Tribune human interest story from 1906, she found it. A photograph of John and Patricia Henderson, a couple in their 30s, holding a tiny Asian infant. The caption read, "Local couple gives home to Operation Baby Lift survivor." Emily stared at the name. Henderson, like Sarah Henderson. Her hands trembled as she pulled up the hospital's staff directory, finding Sarah's profile. Age 45, born 1970, place of birth. Vietnam. "Oh my God," Emily whispered. She looked up to see Robert walking back toward her, his phone pressed to his ear. When he ended the call, his face was grim. "Got the records," he said. "Mom's surgeon in 1910 was a Dr. William Parker, Naval Hospital, San Diego. I did some more digging." He paused, and Emily saw something she rarely saw in her brother's face, uncertainty. "He committed suicide in 1906, shot himself in his home. No note, no explanation. His wife had left him 6 months earlier. He had one son, David Parker, who's still alive and living in San Francisco." "We need to talk to him," Emily said. "I already called. He'll meet with us tomorrow." Emily turned her laptop toward Robert, showing him what she'd found. "And we need to talk to Dr. Henderson, because I think she's Lisa Nguyen. I think she's one of the babies Mom saved, and I don't think she knows it yet." Robert stared at the screen, his legal mind working through the implications. If Henderson is one of the children, and she's been operating on Mom without knowing the connection, it's not a conflict of interest, Robert. It's fate. I don't believe in fate. Maybe it's time you started, Emily said softly. In her office, 3 floors up, Sarah Henderson sat alone with a box of adoption records her parents had left her when they passed. She'd looked through these documents 100 times over the years, but now she saw them differently. The discharge papers from the field hospital in Vietnam, the photograph of a young Navy nurse holding an infant, the notation on the form, saved by Nurse M. Hayes, sang to patient during transport, recommended for commendation. M. Hayes. Margaret Hayes. Margaret Whitmore. Sarah picked up the old photograph, bringing it close to her face. The nurse in the picture was young, exhausted, and infinitely kind, and Sarah knew, with the certainty that transcends logic, that she was looking at the woman who'd just been lying on her operating table, the woman who'd carried 22 names inside her body for 50 years, the woman who'd carried Sarah's old name as well. Tears blurred her vision as she traced the edge of the photograph. "You saved me," she whispered to the young woman frozen in time. "And I never knew. All these years, I never knew." Tomorrow, she would tell Margaret Whitmore the truth. Tonight, she would sit with the weight of impossible coincidence and let herself believe, just for a moment, that some things were meant to be, that some circles were meant to close. Sarah Henderson arrived at Margaret Whitmore's hospital room just after dawn, when the corridors were still quiet and the night shift nurses were preparing to hand over to the day team. She'd been awake all night, sitting with the photographs and documents spread across her kitchen table, trying to find the courage for what she was about to do. She wasn't wearing her white coat. This wasn't a doctor's visit. When she knocked softly on the door, Emily answered, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She took one look at Sarah's face and seemed to understand immediately that something momentous was about to happen. "Dr. Henderson," Emily said quietly, "come in." Maggie was awake, propped up against pillows, looking frail in the morning light. Robert stood by the window, coffee cup in hand, watching the surgeon enter with the wary eyes of someone who'd spent his career reading people for weaknesses. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sarah said, her voice not quite steady, "I need to talk to you about 1970, about Operation Baby Lift." Maggie's hand went to her chest. "You found something about the children?" "Yes." Sarah moved closer to the bed, pulling a chair up beside it. She reached into the folder she'd brought and withdrew the old Polaroid photograph, the one that had been tucked into her adoption papers, the one she'd looked at countless times without truly seeing. She handed it to Maggie with trembling fingers. Maggie took the photograph, and Sarah watched as recognition bloomed across the older woman's face. Her hands began to shake, the photograph quivering between her fingers. "This is me," Maggie whispered, "on the transport, with one of the babies, the smallest one. She cried so much, poor thing, malnourished, terrified. I held her for hours. I sang to her." She looked up at Sarah, tears already streaming down her face. "Where did you get this? From my adoption papers?" Sarah said, and watched Maggie's expression shift from confusion to dawning, impossible understanding. My birth name was Lisa Nguyen. I was 6 months old. In April of 1970, John and Patricia Henderson adopted me and brought me here to Portland and gave me their name and their love and a life I could never have had otherwise. The photograph slipped from Maggie's hands. Emily gasped audibly. Robert set his coffee cup down so hard it clattered. "You're Lisa?" Maggie's voice was barely a breath. "You're my Lisa. I'm your Lisa," Sarah confirmed, her own tears falling freely now. "You saved me. You held me on that flight. My adoption records say you sang to me when I was frightened. You recommended I receive extra medical attention because of my malnutrition. You wrote my name on a list so no one would forget me." "You are my sunshine," Maggie said suddenly. "That's what I sang. That's what I always sang to the frightened ones." "I know that song," Sarah said, her voice breaking completely. "I've always known it. I hum it sometimes without realizing. My parents always thought it was strange that I seemed to know it before they'd ever sung it to me." Maggie reached out with shaking hands, and Sarah took them, leaning forward until their foreheads nearly touched. "I thought you died," Maggie sobbed. "I thought all of them died. 22 babies, 22 beautiful children. I couldn't save them." "But you saved me," Sarah said fiercely. "You saved me, and you never let yourself forget. You carried our names inside you for 50 years. Even when you didn't remember, your body remembered. You kept us close to your heart." "Oh, my body." Maggie pulled Sarah into an embrace, and Sarah let herself be held the way she'd been held as an infant 50 years ago. "My precious baby. You grew up. You became a doctor. You saved me." "The circle closes," Sarah whispered against Maggie's shoulder. "You saved me, and now I saved you." Emily was openly weeping now, and even Robert had turned away, his shoulders rigid with the effort of controlling his emotions. The room felt charged with something beyond ordinary feeling, grief and joy and loss and reunion, all tangled together into something that transcended words. When they finally pulled apart, Maggie cupped Sarah's face in her hands, studying her with fierce intensity. "You're beautiful. You're everything I hoped you'd become. I became a surgeon because someone saved me when I couldn't save myself," Sarah said. "I never knew who until now. I never knew I was looking into your face every day for 20 years, in the mirror, carrying the gift you gave me." 22 others, Maggie said, the grief returning. 22 I couldn't save. "You tried to," Sarah said firmly. "That's what matters. You tried, and you never forgot them. That's more than most people would have done." Robert cleared his throat, and they all turned to look at him. "We're going to San Francisco today," he said, his lawyer voice back in place, though his eyes were suspiciously bright, "to meet with David Parker, the son of the surgeon who placed the capsule inside you. We need to understand why he did it." "I'm coming with you," Sarah said immediately. "Dr. Henderson, you don't need to." Robert started. "I am coming," Sarah repeated, steel in her voice. "This is my story too now. I need to know why someone would do this, what it meant." Robert nodded slowly. "We leave at noon." As he moved toward the door to make arrangements, Emily caught his arm. "Robert, we need to talk about something I've known for a while. About you." Robert stiffened. "Emily, not now." "When, then?" Emily's voice was gentle but insistent. When are we going to talk about the fact that you don't have any photographs from before you were 2 years old about why Mom always got quiet when you asked about your birth? The color drained from Robert's face. What are you talking about? Emily glanced at Maggie, who had closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Mom, I'm sorry. I found your journal 10 years ago. I've kept your secret, but I can't anymore. Not after this. Not after we've seen what secrets do. What secret? Robert's voice was dangerous now. The voice he used in depositions when he was closing in for the kill. Emily looked at her brother, and Sarah saw a lifetime of protective instinct warring with the need for truth. The name on the list wasn't just Lisa Nguyen. There was another name. Robert Tran, 18 months old, assigned to the Margaret Hayes family. The silence that followed was absolute. Robert looked at his mother, who was openly sobbing now, unable to meet his eyes. Mom, I was going to tell you, Maggie whispered. I was always going to tell you, but then it had been so long, and you were so happy, and I was so afraid you'd think you weren't really mine. I'm not your son, Robert said flatly, and the words landed like stones in still water. I'm one of them, one of the 23. You're my son, Maggie said fiercely. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. Choice does. I chose you, Robert. Every single day I chose you. But Robert was already walking out the door, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. And Emily was calling after him, and Sarah was frozen in place, watching as the revelation that should have brought healing instead tore everything apart. The drive to San Francisco took 6 hours through rain that turned the Pacific Coast Highway into a blur of gray. Robert had left Portland without a word to anyone, checking into a hotel near his office and refusing to answer calls from Emily or his mother. It was Sarah who finally reached him, her voice calm and professional, when she said simply, If you want answers about why someone did this to your mother, I'm driving to San Francisco tomorrow. You can come or not. He'd met her in the hospital parking lot at dawn, his face haggard, his suit wrinkled. They'd driven in silence for the first hour before Robert finally spoke. My entire life is a lie. Your life is your life, Sarah replied, keeping her eyes on the road. The facts of how it started don't change what you've made of it. Easy for you to say. You always knew you were adopted. I knew the circumstances of my adoption, Sarah corrected. I didn't know that the surgeon who'd been my doctor for 20 years was the nurse who saved me 50 years ago. I didn't know I'd been carrying that connection around with me my whole life. Invisible, but real. Robert was quiet for a long moment. How do you live with not knowing where you came from, who your real parents were? They're dead, Sarah said bluntly. They died in a war that ended before I could form memories. Margaret Whitmore is alive. She raised you. She loved you. That's not nothing. Robert, that's everything. She lied to me. She protected you. There's a difference. Is there? Robert's voice was bitter, because from where I'm sitting, it feels like the same thing. They arrived at David Parker's home in the Sunset District just before noon. The house was modest, a narrow Victorian painted pale blue with white trim. David answered the door himself, a man in his late 60s, with his father's build and his mother's sad eyes. He led them into a living room crowded with books and photographs, offering coffee that neither of them could drink. "I've been expecting someone to come eventually," David said, settling into an armchair. "My father left papers, instructions. He said someday someone would ask questions." "About Margaret Whitmore," Sarah said gently, "about the woman he loved." David reached for a wooden box on the side table, his hands steady, but his expression weighted with old grief. "My father was a good man, brilliant surgeon, devoted to his patients. But he was also deeply troubled. My mother left him in 1905 because she couldn't live with his obsession anymore." "Obsession with what?" Robert asked sharply. "With Nurse Margaret Hayes." David opened the box and withdrew a yellowed envelope, sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. "This is his suicide note, not the one the police found that was just a formality. An apology to my mother. This is the real one, the one he left for Margaret, though he never sent it. I found it in his safe deposit box after he died." He handed the envelope to Sarah, who broke the seal with careful fingers. Inside were 2 pages covered in tight, precise handwriting. She read aloud, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "To whoever finds this, I pray it reaches Margaret Hayes before I lose the courage to explain what I have done. I met Margaret in April of 1907 when she came through the Naval Hospital in San Diego after evacuating from Saigon. She was devastated, barely sleeping, talking in her sleep about babies she couldn't save. 23 names. She whispered them over and over like a prayer or a confession. I fell in love with her the moment I saw her weeping in the hospital chapel. But she loved another man, Thomas. She spoke of him constantly. And when he came to take her home, I saw the way she looked at him and knew I had lost before I'd ever had a chance. In September, she came to my emergency room with acute appendicitis. While I was operating, while she was unconscious and vulnerable, I saw my opportunity. She'd kept a list of those children's names in her wallet. I found it when the nurses removed her belongings. 23 names, carefully written, some with small crosses beside them, the ones she'd learned had died in the crash. I took that list and I placed it inside her, sewn into a surgical-grade titanium capsule that would last a lifetime. I told myself I was helping her, preserving the memory of those children in a way she couldn't lose. But the truth is simpler and more selfish. I wanted to be inside her, even if only as a ghost, even if only through this violation. I wanted to give her something permanent, something she would carry with her always from me. I know this is unforgivable. I know I violated every oath I took, every principle of medical ethics, every boundary of human decency. But I loved her, and I couldn't bear the thought of those children being forgotten. So I made sure she would carry them forever, whether she knew it or not. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I can't live with what I've done. I can't face the man in the mirror who claimed to be a healer while committing such an intimate assault. Please tell Margaret I'm sorry. Please tell her I loved her. Please tell her the children's names are safe, that they'll be with her until her last breath, and that maybe that's a gift, even if it came from hands that had no right to give it. Forgive me, I can't forgive myself, but Dr. William Parker. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah carefully refolded the letter, her hands shaking now, David Parker had tears running down his weathered face. "He shot himself 3 weeks after writing that," David said quietly. "Left it in a sealed envelope with my name on it, to be opened only if someone came asking about Margaret Hayes. I've been the keeper of this secret for 49 years. He assaulted her," Robert said, his voice cold with rage. "He violated her body without consent, and you kept it secret." "What good would it have done to tell her?" David shot back. "My father was dead. The capsule was inside her. Removing it would have required surgery with no medical benefit. I made a choice to let sleeping dogs lie." "That wasn't your choice to make." Robert stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal, "just like it wasn't my mother's choice to hide my identity from me. Everyone in my family apparently thinks lying and hiding and violating consent is acceptable as long as you claim you're doing it out of love." "Robert!" Sarah started. "No." He turned on her, his face flushed. "Don't defend this, any of this. A doctor put a foreign object inside my mother without permission. My mother hid my entire identity from me for 52 years. Everyone acts like these are noble sacrifices when they're just different flavors of betrayal." "Your mother was trying to protect you," David said. "I didn't need protection." Robert snarled. "I needed truth. I needed to know who I actually am. My name isn't even Robert Whitmore. It's Robert Tran. My parents died in a war I knew nothing about. I have a culture, a heritage, an identity that was stolen from me, and everyone acts like I should be grateful for the theft." He grabbed his jacket, heading for the door. Sarah moved to follow him, but he held up a hand. "Don't. I need to think. I need to figure out who the hell I actually am without everyone telling me what I should feel about it." The door slammed behind him, and Sarah sank back into her chair. Exhausted, David poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. "Your father's letter said Margaret whispered the names in her sleep," Sarah said after a moment. "That she marked some with crosses, the ones who died." "Yes. My name was on that list. Lisa Nguyen. I survived the crash, but 22 others didn't." As Sarah looked at David directly. "Your father's action, as wrong as it was, preserved their memory. If he hadn't done what he did, those names might have been lost. Margaret might have forgotten them eventually. The way trauma makes us forget. Instead, she carried them. For 50 years, she carried them. Does that justify what he did?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "But it makes it complicated. And sometimes complicated is the only truth we get." She found Robert 2 hours later, sitting on a bench overlooking the bay. His expensive suit jacket discarded beside him. His eyes were red, his face raw with emotion. She sat down without asking permission. "I'm 52 years old," he said without looking at her. "I've built a life, a career, an identity, and now I find out it's all built on a foundation of lies." "It's built on love," Sarah countered. "Imperfect, flawed, sometimes misguided love, but love nonetheless." "I'm going to sue her," Robert said flatly, "for identity fraud, for emotional damages, for—" "For what?" Sarah interrupted. "For raising you, for giving you opportunities you never would have had in an orphanage, for loving you enough to be terrified of losing you. She should have told me." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "She should have. And I'm sure she'll spend the rest of her life wishing she had. But if you sue her, If you turn this into a legal battle, you'll get money you don't need and lose the only mother you've ever had. Is that really what you want?" Robert finally looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the lost boy he'd once been, the 18-month-old child pulled from the wreckage of two worlds. "I don't know who I am anymore." "You're Robert Whitmore," Sarah said simply. "Or Robert Tran, or both. You're a successful attorney. You're a son, biological or not. You're a man at a crossroads, trying to figure out how to reconcile the past you didn't know with the present you've built. That's who you are. The rest is just details." He didn't respond, just turned back to the bay, watching the fog roll in over the water. Sarah sat with him in silence as the afternoon bled into evening. Two survivors of the same catastrophe, 50 years apart, trying to figure out how to live with truths that changed everything and nothing at all. Sarah found Robert 3 days later at his Seattle office. Buried in case files he wasn't reading, staring at his computer screen without seeing it. His assistant had tried to turn her away, but Sarah simply walked past her with the confidence of someone who'd spent years navigating hospital bureaucracy. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, closing his office door behind her, "we need to talk." Robert didn't look up. "I have nothing to say to you." "Then listen." Sarah set a worn leather journal on his desk, the one Emily had pressed into her hands before she left Portland, whispering, "Make him read it, please." She pushed it toward him. "Your mother kept this. From 1976 to 1980. Emily found it years ago and has been carrying the weight of that knowledge ever since. She thought she was protecting you by staying silent. Now she knows better." "I don't want to read my mother's diary." "It's not a diary," Sarah said firmly. "It's a record. Of you, of what you meant to her, of why she made the choices she made." She stood. "I'm not leaving until you read it. I've cleared my schedule. I can stand here all day if necessary." Robert finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate slowness, he opened the journal. The first entry was dated October 15th, 1906. Maggie's handwriting was younger then, less certain, the letters pressed deep into the page as if she'd been gripping the pen too hard. "Thomas and I brought Robert home today, 18 months old, so small, so frightened. He cried for 3 hours straight. Nothing we did would comfort him. I held him and sang, 'You Are My Sunshine,' the song I sang to all of them, and he finally fell asleep against my shoulder. I promised him then that he would never be alone again, that I would love him enough for all the mothers he'd lost." Robert's hands tightened on the journal, but he kept reading. "November 3rd, 1906. Robert smiled at me today. Really smiled. Not the polite reflex, but a genuine expression of joy. Thomas said I was being ridiculous, that all babies smile. But this was different. This was Robert seeing me and choosing happiness. I cried in the bathroom afterward because I kept thinking about the 22 who never got to smile like that, who never got to feel safe enough to be happy. Robert is my second chance, my way of making sure at least one of them gets the life they deserved." January 12, 1907, Robert took his first steps today, straight into my arms, like he trusted me to catch him. And I realized that's what I've been doing ever since we brought him home, catching him, building a net of safety and love and normalcy around him so he never has to know about the chaos he came from. Thomas asked again if we should tell him the truth when he's older. I said no, not because I'm ashamed, but because I wanted him to feel chosen, not rescued. There's a difference. June 8, 1978. Robert learned a new word today, Mama. He says it all the time now, for everything. Mama for food, Mama for comfort, Mama when he's scared of the dark. Every time he says it, my heart breaks and heals in the same moment. I'm not the mother who gave birth to him, but I'm the mother who's here. That has to be enough. April 4, 1970, today is the 4th anniversary of the crash. Robert doesn't know this date means anything, and he never will if I can help it. But I lit 22 candles after he went to bed, one for each child I couldn't save. I whispered their names like a prayer. Michael, David, Jennifer, all of them. And then I held Robert while he slept and thanked whatever force in the universe let me keep this one, let me save this one. He's not a replacement for them. He's his own person, miraculous and whole. But loving him helps me forgive myself for the ones I lost. December 25th, 1980. Robert is 4.5 now. Emily is 6 months old. We're a family, a real family. Thomas asked me again about telling Robert the truth someday, and for the first time, I considered it. But then I watched Robert playing with his baby sister, so gentle and patient, and I thought, what good would it do? He's happy. He's loved. He has a home and a future. The past can't give him anything but pain. So I'll keep his secret the way Dr. Parker kept mine. I'll carry it inside me where it can't hurt him. That's what mothers do. We carry the weight so our children don't have to. The journal entries continued for several more pages, documenting Robert's childhood in careful detail. His first day of school, his first lost tooth, his little league games, his adolescent rebellions. Woven through all of it was Maggie's fierce, protective love and her recurring fear that someday Robert would find out the truth and hate her for hiding it. The final entry was dated March 3rd, 1980, when Robert was 9 years old. Robert asked me today if he was adopted. A kid at school told him he looked too Asian to be my real son. I wanted to lie, but I couldn't. So I told him yes, he was adopted, but that he was chosen, wanted, loved beyond measure. He asked if I knew his birth parents, because I said they died in the war, which is true, as far as I know. He asked if he was Vietnamese. I said yes. He asked if that changed anything between us. I told him it changed nothing, that he was mine and I was his, and that's all that mattered. He seemed satisfied with that, but tonight, after he went to bed, I found him looking at his face in the mirror, touching his features like he was trying to understand what they meant. I wanted to tell him then about Operation Baby Lift, about the 23 children, about how he was one of the miracles. But I couldn't find the words, so I just held him and promised that wherever he came from, he would always have a home with me. Robert closed the journal, his vision blurred. Sarah handed him a tissue without comment. She told me I was adopted when I was 9, he said hoarsely. I remember that conversation. She told me my birth parents died in the war, that they would have loved me if they could have. I accepted it and moved on. I never asked for the details. Because you didn't need them, Sarah said gently. You had everything you needed, a mother who loved you, a home, a life. The specifics didn't matter until now. Robert's phone rang. He glanced at it, intending to ignore the call, but the name on the screen made him freeze. Unknown number. San Diego area code. Answer it, Sarah said. He did. Putting it on speaker, an elderly man's voice crackled through. Is this Robert Whitmore? Yes. Who is this? My name is Colonel Frank Donovan, retired. I served with your mother in Vietnam. I heard about what happened, about the capsule, about the names. I need to talk to you about Operation Baby Lift. Robert and Sarah exchanged glances. Go ahead. I was on that flight, Frank said, his voice heavy with age and regret. April 4th, 1970. I was helping load the children when the plane went down. I survived. 22 children didn't, and I've lived with that guilt for 50 years. My mother has too, Robert said quietly. I know. That's why I'm calling. Because I need you to understand something about Margaret Hayes, about your mother. Frank took a shaky breath. When that plane crashed, when everything was chaos and fire and screaming, your mother didn't run. She could have. She was close to an exit, but she went back into the flames for those children. She pulled 3 of them out before the fuselage collapsed. You were one of them. I saw her carry you out in her arms, saw her do CPR on you until you coughed and cried. She saved your life, son, twice. Once by pulling you from the wreckage, and once by giving you a home. Robert's throat closed. Why are you telling me this? Because I made a different choice that day. I ran. I saved myself and left 2 children behind because I was afraid. I've lived with that cowardice every day since. Your mother lived with survivor's guilt, yes, but she has nothing to be guilty about. She did everything she could. She saved everyone she could reach. And then she spent the rest of her life making sure those children were never forgotten. Frank's voice broke. Don't punish her for loving you so much she was afraid to lose you. Don't make the mistake I made letting pride and fear steal the time you have left together. The line went dead. Robert sat motionless, the phone still in his hand, his mind replaying Frank's words. She went back into the flames. She pulled you out. She saved your life. I need to see my mother, he said abruptly. Standing, Sarah smiled, relief flooding her features. I'll drive. They made the trip to Portland in 5 hours. Robert silent for most of the drive, occasionally glancing at his phone where he'd pulled up everything he could find about Operation Baby Lift, the photographs of the wreckage, the casualty lists, the stories of survivors who'd spent their lives wondering why they'd been spared when others hadn't. He read about the nurses and volunteers who'd gone back into the burning plane, who'd pulled children from the twisted metal, who'd performed CPR on tiny bodies until ambulances arrived. He read about Margaret Hayes receiving a commendation for heroism, though the official record didn't mention her name, just Navy Nurse Hayes, for exceptional courage in the rescue of Operation Baby Lift survivors. By the time they reached Portland General Hospital, Robert knew what he needed to do. He found his mother awake, sitting up in bed, looking frailer than he'd ever seen her. Emily was there, holding her hand. When Robert walked in, Maggie's face crumpled. I'm sorry, she whispered. Robert, I'm so sorry. I should have told you. I should have. Robert crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees beside her bed. Mom, stop. I was afraid you'd think you weren't really mine, that you'd hate me for keeping secrets, that I'd lose you. Maggie's words tumbled out through tears. You're my son. Blood or not, you're my son. And I loved you from the moment I pulled you from that plane. I know. Robert took her hands, gripping them tightly. Colonel Donovan called me. He told me what you did, how you went back, how you saved me. Maggie stared at him, comprehension slowly dawning. Frank called you. He said you were a hero. That you saved every one you could reach?" Robert's voice cracked. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I made this about me when it was always about love. When you've been carrying this weight for 50 years and added to it, you have every right to be angry. Maybe. But I don't want to be." Robert lifted her hands to his face. "My name might be Robert Tran on some old documents, but I'm Robert Whitmore, your son. The person you raised, the life you gave me, that's who I am. The rest is just history." Maggie sobbed, pulling him into an embrace. Emily joined them, and Sarah stood back, witnessing the family knit itself back together, stronger for having been broken. "I love you, Mom," Robert said into his mother's shoulder. "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for being brave enough to lie when you thought the truth would hurt me. I love you too." "Sweetheart," Maggie whispered, "I always have. I always will. No matter what." 2 days later, Margaret Whitmore was discharged from Portland General Hospital. Her children brought her home to a house filled with flowers, roses from the garden she'd tended, lilies from the church she'd quietly attended for decades, and wildflowers picked by her grandchildren who'd made welcome home signs in crayon and glitter. Sarah Henderson came too, not as a doctor but as something more complicated and profound. She stood in the doorway of Maggie's living room, looking at the black and white photograph on the mantel, the young Navy nurse she now recognized as the woman who'd saved her life. "I'd like to stay in touch," Sarah said quietly, "if that's not too strange." Maggie reached for her hand. "Strange, sweetheart. You're a miracle. Having you in my life isn't strange. It's grace." They embraced, and Robert watched from across the room, still processing everything that had unfolded. Emily squeezed his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his own. "I need to do something," Maggie announced suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "For the 22, they deserve to be remembered properly, not just as names on a list. They deserve a memorial." Robert nodded slowly. "I can help with that. We can organize something through the church." "I want it to be simple," Maggie said. "Just family and anyone who was connected to Operation Babylift. Nothing elaborate. Just acknowledgement that they existed, that they mattered, that they were loved." The memorial service was held 2 weeks later at St. Mary's Catholic Church, a small stone building nestled in the hills above Portland. The pews held a modest gathering. Robert, Emily and her family, Sarah and her husband James, David Parker, who'd flown up from San Francisco, Colonel Frank Donovan, who'd made the journey despite his age, and a handful of other Operation Babylift survivors who'd heard about the service through veterans networks. 22 white candles stood on the altar, each one bearing a small card with a name written in Maggie's careful handwriting. Michael Tran, Jennifer Nguyen, David Lay, my fam, the litany of children who'd never grown up, never celebrated birthdays, never had the chance to become the people they might have been. Maggie stood at the front, her hands gripping the podium for support, and spoke without notes. "I carried these children for 3 days in April of 1970, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. "I've fed them, changed them, sang to them, promised them they would be safe. When the plane went down, I couldn't keep that promise for 22 of them. For 50 years, I've carried that failure inside me literally. As it turned out," soft laughter rippled through the gathering, breaking some of the solemnity. "But I've learned something these past few weeks. I've learned that carrying them wasn't a burden, it was a privilege. These children mattered. They were loved, even if only briefly. They had names, identities, souls. And as long as I remember them, as long as we remember them, they're not truly gone. She stepped away from the podium and approached the candles, lighting the first one. Michael Tran, 2 years old, he loved to laugh. Sarah stood and joined her, lighting the second candle. Jennifer and Gwyn, 8 months old, she had the most beautiful dark eyes. One by one, the others came forward. Robert lit a candle, Emily lit another. Colonel Donovan's hands shook as he lit one for the 2 children he'd left behind, whispering apologies into the flickering flame. David Parker lit one for the father who'd tried to preserve these memories in the only way his broken heart could imagine. When all 22 candles were burning, casting dancing shadows across the altar, the small congregation sang, "You Are My Sunshine," the song that Maggie had sung to frightened children on a doomed plane, the song Sarah had always known without knowing why, the song that connected them all across 50 years and impossible circumstances. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Afterward, they gathered in the parish hall for coffee and cookies. Maggie sat in a comfortable chair, surrounded by people who understood what she'd carried. Colonel Donovan knelt beside her, his weathered face wet with tears. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not forgetting, for not letting them disappear." "They were never going to disappear," Maggie replied, touching his hand. "They've been with me every day." 2 years passed. Margaret Whitmore turned 82 and proved more resilient than her doctors expected. The surgery had removed the capsule and the benign tumor, but it had also seemed to remove a weight she'd carried her entire adult life. She smiled more easily, laughed more readily, allowed herself to be happy in a way she never had before. Robert moved back to Portland, taking a position with a smaller firm that gave him better work-life balance. He spent every Sunday at his mother's house, often with his new girlfriend, a kind woman named Lisa, which made Maggie laugh every time she heard the name. He was learning Vietnamese from an online tutor, slowly reclaiming a heritage he'd never known was his. Some days it felt right. Some days it felt like wearing someone else's clothes, but it was his choice now. And that made all the difference. Emily's family expanded when she gave birth to a daughter, Margaret Sarah, named for the 2 women who'd taught her that love was stronger than biology. Sarah Henderson remained a constant presence in their lives, having dinner with Maggie once a month, bringing her children to visit their honorary grandmother. She'd framed the old photograph, the young nurse holding baby Lisa, and kept it in her office, where she could see it every day. On a warm spring morning in April, the monument was unveiled in Portland's Washington Park. 23 bronze wings arranged in a circle, each one etched with a name. 22 angels who'd died, one who'd survived to tell their story. The dedication plaque read, "Operation Baby Lift, April 1975, in memory of the 138 lives lost and in honor of those who carried them home. Love transcends time. Memory transcends death." Maggie stood before the monument, supported by Robert on one side and Sarah on the other, with Emily and her children gathered close. The morning sun caught the bronze wings, making them seem almost alive, almost ready to take flight. Children played in the park around them, unaware of the history embedded in the sculpture, the grief and love and impossible connections that had led to this moment, and that, Maggie thought, was exactly right. The monument wasn't for the children. It was for the ones who'd survived, who needed to remember, who needed to transform, carrying into something beautiful. "They're not really gone," she said softly, to no one in particular. "They're here. They've always been here." Robert squeezed her shoulder. Sarah took her hand, and together, the family that had been torn apart and rebuilt stood in the morning light, whole. This story isn't just about Margaret Whitmore. It's about all of us who've carried secrets we thought would protect the people we love. It's about the weight of choices made in impossible moments, about discovering that the foundations we've built our lives upon were more complicated than we knew. How many of us have kept silent to spare someone pain, only to realize that truth, even difficult truth, is a gift. Margaret carried 23 names inside her body for 50 years. But she also carried something else, the belief that love meant protecting others from hard realities. Robert learned that his entire identity was built on information withheld, yet he discovered that who he'd become mattered more than how he'd started. Sarah found that the hands that saved her as an infant were the same hands she'd held during surgery 50 years later. These three people teach us that family isn't defined by blood or perfect honesty, but by showing up, by choosing each other, by carrying what needs to be carried until we're strong enough to set it down. The question isn't whether we've kept secrets or been kept from truth. The question is, what do we do when the truth finally emerges? Do we let it destroy what we've built, or do we use it to build something stronger? What secrets have you carried to protect someone you love? Have you ever discovered a truth that changed how you saw your past, but not who you chose to become? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.